So, by way of breakup of the book, in my mind anyway, chapters 1 through 5, we see that they're prepping to go into the land. They're getting everything in order according to what God is telling them. 6 through 12, they conquer the lands. And we always talk about how they didn't conquer everybody, and that became their snare. But essentially, they gained control of the land by then. 31 kings they overcame. And then chapters 13 through 22 is the dividing up of the land. And chapter 23 is basically Joshua giving them a farewell notice. And chapter 24 is the rededication of the people to God. Joshua does a really good job of saying, what's it going to be? And they say, we're going to obey God. So he makes sure that they rededicate to that covenant that God is giving them. Now, there's several things. We'll get into chapter 2, but just to back up even further concerning the brutality of what's going on. This is war. And in war, people die. And in war, in any instance, there's one of two ways of doing it. You can have some mercy on the people and allow some people to live. Or you can just slaughter everybody. That's the way war went. And in this case, God is ordering the slaughter of all the peoples of these 7 nations for specific reasons. When you go to Romans, and I'm just going to encapsulate this very quickly, I would suggest you look at these passages. If you have any questions about why God did this, Paul explains that these people knew God. They knew who he was, but they did not reverence him, and they did not put him in his proper place, and they gave themselves over to all kinds of sin. In Genesis 15, when God makes his covenant with Abraham, let's not forget, Moses talks about that covenant over and over and over and over again in Deuteronomy. The importance of that covenant. Because it wasn't just about Abraham. He didn't maybe know that at the time. He talks about the Amorites. God tells him it's going to be 400 years, 430 years, because the sin of the Amorites is not complete yet. In other words, it's not time for their judgment yet. And if you want to find out what they were doing, go to Leviticus 18. It talks about the sins of the Amorites, which is basically one sexual debauchery after another, all kinds of incestual stuff, all kinds of stuff I don't even like to talk about or read about, but I read it anyway. And, of course, as Barry talked about, the killing of their children, burning them alive before Molech. And there were all sorts of other issues going on. They had so many gods of the land. I tried to do a little research, but it was just too extensive to see how many there were. It was basically wherever you went, there was a new god. So that was the big reason why God brought them in. In Joshua 24, we see that Joshua is fulfilling that prophecy that God made in Genesis 15 concerning the Amorites. So this is why we see this. As disturbing as it is, God is exacting judgment against peoples because of what they had become and where they had led themselves. And what I like to tell people who are concerned about what God is doing is, let's not forget, all souls belong to God. If a child was killed, that child's soul was given over to God. If he's innocent, he was innocent. If somebody was a grown-up and responsible to themselves, they had to answer to that before God. So anyway, we could go on and on and on about it. I didn't want to get hung up on that too much. But this is God's realm. This is what he's doing. We'll see that at the end of chapter 5, most especially. So, getting into chapter 2. Great chapter. As a Christian, and the only reason why we're here is because of the Christ. We would not be here if there was no Christ. We might not even know about God. Or maybe, if God wanted us to know about him today, in the way we know him, he would make it happen. But God's plan was to have a Christ come, the Messiah, the great one, who would do God's bidding. In other words, he would sacrifice himself for us. And this is where we see Rahab come into the picture. We see this great foreshadowing of the power of God being exercised before his people even go into the land. They didn't know this was the thing. What a weird thing it is. He picks this lowly harlot to do his bidding. And we have to see, again, the foreshadowing of God's wisdom in this. What does it tell us as Christians? We're here because of the Christ, right? In other words, Rahab bears Boaz, right? She marries Salmon and bears Boaz. And which in and of itself is a great story. Because consider that here is a Jewish person marrying somebody they had overthrown. That was a big deal. I don't know. We have to make the assumption that God made an exception for this in this case. Everybody else was to be wiped out. We know that because of what she made a covenant with the Jews, a foreshadowing of what would happen. Through the Jews, God would bring his covenant. Man, this is just powerful. This is so powerful. If we miss this, we miss, in my mind, as a Christian, we miss the whole point. Yeah, it's great that God does miracles, but if we don't see the Christ in the story, we miss the entire point of this story, in my opinion. So, of course, we know the story of Boaz. Again, just foreshadowing, is the story of redemption and the buying back of something that once belonged to somebody. And that is the story of the Christ. Okay, any questions before we finish this chapter? Anything that we talked about last week?
Just to answer your question, it took 7 years to conquer the land.
It took 7. That, I read that, but and I actually saw somebody cite the timeline, and it may have been a Jewish source, but I just didn't see it in the scriptures. Anyway, if you find it in the scriptures, let me know where it is.
It was 1406 to 1399 BC.
Okay. So 7 years is pretty quick, but they didn't stop fighting because we know, it's stated that Joshua fights for a very long time. So anyway, we'll get into all that stuff when it comes up. So, okay, so the last 2 questions to finish this up. We've already talked about the reference to Rahab in Matthew, right? That's the genealogy. And then in Hebrews as well, where she's listed among all of these, faithful greats within the Jewish tradition. And then in James, and this is what we're going to cover today, the question is, what example does Rahab stand for in James 21 through 26? And then he asks, what is the background of Rahab, and what is God showing about how he saves his people? So I'm going to turn to, if you want to just turn to James chapter 2. James chapter 2. So we know James is, he's kind of filling in some of the blanks that some people had drawn from other teaching about faith. And he's trying to point people toward the fact that faith is nothing if you're not working. If you have no good deeds, which is what we'll be judged on, how can you show your faith? So, and we talked about that extensively. So let's read 21 through 26. Let's just actually start at 20. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered Isaac, his son, on the altar? You see that it is his faith and his actions that were working together. And his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. So what is James saying about Rahab, and how does that affect the Christian? How would that affect our walk in life? What is he saying there? Anybody? It's pretty simple. It says it right there. Why do you have to repeat it? Right?
I think it's so cool to see that the nation, the whole city, let's say at least, Jericho, where she was so scared of God and his power and these Israelites because they've seen what they've done and everything. And out of that whole city, she's the only one who did anything about it in respect of that fear. And so you see that the action was led by what she understood about God and what she feared from him. But she wanted to be on that side. So you see faith working that way. Once we see who God is, we can't just stop right there, because then we're the same as the demons, according to James. We're just the same.
Okay.
They shudder because they know who God is. And that's why I think it's neat to equate the city like the demons. They're doing the exact same thing. We know who you are.
So faith is to generate motivation, right? Yeah. Kathy and then Dave.
Also, she could have been a hero of the Canaanite nation by turning in the spies. But she didn't.
For a little while, yeah.
Pardon me?
For a little while.
Yeah.
A couple of days maybe,
But
who knows?
she worked on her faith because she knew who God was, that he was powerful and only God.
Yeah, I said this last week. It is such a powerful statement that when she says, your God is the living God. And I equated that with what Ruth said. I mean, there's that whole story. There's that Gentile connection to God right there. And you see, Ruth, the same thing. Your God will be my God. She gives up on her God and adopts God. Well, he adopts her. But yeah. Dave.
Well, it says here already, basically, that our faith works together with the works of God, and we demonstrate it through that. It would have been easy for her, like so many of us in the world, say, I believe in God, and do nothing to demonstrate it. And so that's a pretty important thing, because it's not that you're trying to, we all know you're not trying to work for it, add up a tally sheet, but what we are doing is showing that it's active in our life, and it's changing our life and causing us to serve a godly life. Demonstration is critical in this with our faith, because she could have said, I believe in God, but I'm not helping you. I'm not going to do anything. I was afraid, but so I just think that this is pretty important for us. Too many times I think we don't demonstrate our faith with the godly works. Not talking about our desires, but about what God says for us to do.
Right. I put talk, because a lot of people will want to talk the talk about having faith. And I wanted to add something, but go ahead, man.
Sometimes, most of the time, all the time, we think too highly of ourselves. We think, we know we can make a difference, but sometimes we think we're great or whatever. We have problems with pride. But God works through us. And without works, there's nothing working through us. So we have to have the faith to allow God to work through us. And Rahab allowed God to work through her to save the spies. And of course, if you're dead, God can't work through you. So faith without works is dead. So, but it's God that causes the growth. It's God that works through us.
I agree, she had the right attitude. She understood the concept of being a servant and was humble already. I would agree with that. And so that, maybe she was just the right person because of that. I just wanted to say, as far as saying you have faith, I've already said this several times. We see in Exodus the people praying to God so fervently. They're crying out to Him. Deliver us. They have great faith in God until it gets tested. And then once it was tested, they showed that they didn't understand what that faith was. Now, I tend to hope and pray that those people, even though they died in the desert, that they were changed by the time that their deaths came. God gave them the opportunity to change that concept of service to God, that sometimes you have to do some uncomfortable things. I mean, in their case, very uncomfortable things. Yes, Randy?
Just a small added perspective. When we give up sin, then God, we become powerful for God. When a servant hangs on to sin, he's weak and kind of not usable. So the whole key is you give up your life, you give it to God, and then we become powerful. God can use us.
So there's a transformation
Yes.
that has to happen. And if anybody brings that to the fore, it's Jesus. It's the Christ who brings that. This isn't just about you earning your way to heaven and then leveraging your greatness before God so you can get into heaven. That's not it. It's about being transformed to be more like Him. Anybody else? Okay, so what was it about? I mean, the question is, what is her background? She's a prostitute. And how is it that this story shows us how God can save us? Yes, Andrea.
I see it as it doesn't matter how bad of a person or how bad of a route you've taken in life, there's always a pathway to God.
Okay. He's open to you, to us. He's like the father waiting for the prodigal son. That's one of my favorite visuals. The father, he isn't like, that son, I'm done with him. He's looking for him. And when the son's there, and he's running for him and kill the calf, and here's a ring, and he's waiting, and that is the visual that we're given of God. He's waiting. He's always open to our return. Dave?
Well, Rahab, let's put it in perspective. She probably her whole life was taught about the idols and the gods and
Right.
God for air and dust and whatever else they had. And that's a pretty hard thing to overcome. And if you put it in relationship to today, when you're talking to someone in the religious community and they've been taught false doctrine their entire life, you're trying to teach them the Word of God. Now, fortunately, she had her heart and ears open. And when she heard the truth, she understood that was the truth. And so, point is that she took a huge leap, in my opinion, to just step away from those gods and those idols and risk her physical life for that. And it's a huge example to me because how many of us can say we would do that? I mean, it's very hard to do that because you got your parents and you got your family and all this.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard, man. There's a lot of draws we don't consider. Trying to pull us, trying to constantly pull us back in the world. It's amazing. So, anyways, I thought for Rahab, that was a big thing for her to step out of that and serve God.
Okay. Scott, and then Randy.
He just made me think of this a little bit, but it's so cool to see, like he said, she's been raised around these other gods. But once you see God for who he really is, if you really look and see who God is, then look how he stood out to her as so much better than all those other things. And so, the comparison of what we struggle with in getting caught up in life and caught up in sin, and if we look at God properly, we see which side is the strong side to be on. Once we see that, and when you compare what sin does for you, because it's enticing, it's hard to give up. It's addictive and all that, right? And we get caught up in it. The world gets a hold of us, and we can't seem to get out of it. That's because we're not seeing how good God is in comparison to all of that.
To anything else, right?
Yeah, and she's able to see that so clearly, and it's so cool. And anybody that does that, you watch them, that's what changes them. Looking at God is what changes you, not this, I just think I'm going to be a better person, so I'm going to step up to the standard,
Right.
Seems like a better life, so I'm
Exactly.
going to do that. That's hard. We struggle with that. That's why we struggle as Christians to be better, because we're still not focusing on God as enough. We're not seeing who he is and what he's done and what he can do. And, anyways, it just needs
I like
to see
that. I like that thought. You're letting God do it,
Yeah.
but you're doing it. And this is something that, if you're thinking physically, it's a contradiction. How am I? If I'm not doing it, then why am I doing anything? And it does make. But if I'm not saved by my work, why is works important? It can be confusing, but we know God does it. This is something God created. So it might be confusing if we're thinking in this physical sense. But that's the equation, right? God is open for us, but we have to see him honestly, like you're saying. I can't do it. I need that. I need the guy who's hanging on the cross. And I need to be prostrate before it. I need to be face down in front of the cross in order to understand what God is trying to do in my life. Yes, Randy?
You mentioned the overshadowing of Christ. If you don't see that in this, you miss the whole point. Today in this society, the Christian society today, we look down on the harlot in society today. And here we have a harlot in a pagan city that God said he's going to destroy, completely annihilate. And we know the story of the walls tumbling, what happened. And that was planned ahead of time. But then if Rahab can humble herself and turn to God in faith, and she can be saved, not only that, but in the line of Christ, then anybody today through Christ can be saved. And that is extremely, like you said, humbling.
Amen. Yeah, so there's that component of humility that God's looking for. And all you have to do is look at the Old Testament heroes. And who is God choosing? The oldest son? No, get that kid out there, tending the sheep. He's probably stinky and smelly, but bring him in here. I want to talk to him. And this is what God does, and it just baffles everybody. But that's who he is, because of who he is. Okay, anybody else want to add anything to that? Okay, we're going to get into chapter 3. And chapter 3 is another great miracle that God does for them, for their faithful benefit. And there's some things that need to happen before it happens, and there's a history behind all of that, especially with the Ark of the Covenant. And I'm not sure about the Ark in this instance, but I do know that the Ark of the Covenant was one of those holy things that when it was in the tabernacle, not just anybody could see it. And if you saw it, you would die. And I forget where we read that. I think it's in Numbers. And so whenever they would transport it, they would cover it. Now some Some translations say they covered it in porpoise skins because it says it's blue. Some say it was a badger's skin, so I don't know. You know, take your pick. Go to the ocean. I don't know how they caught porpoises during those days anyways. They could, you know, go out in the boat and catch a porpoise. I don't know. Anyway, that's not important. But the important part is that this is one of the holy items that God has specific instructions for. And there are specific instructions as for its transportation, and it becomes this sort of, oh man, I don't want to use this. You know, Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know. Hitler wanted it because it was this powerful thing. Well, I could see Steven Spielberg looking at the text and reading it going, oh, and looking into the story going, this is plausible that somebody would see this Ark of the Covenant as some powerful device because it's going before them into battle. But there's these really tricky things as to how they were to treat it. And in this instance, they're supposed to hang back like a half mile or so. So let's read verses 1 through 6. Chapter 3 of James? No. Chapter 3 of Joshua. Early in the morning. Now this is after the report, the good report of the two spies who came back and gave a good report and said, the people are melting before us, let's do this. Early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. Sounds reasonable. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Joshua said to the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on ahead of the people. So they took it up and went ahead of them. Okay. So what is God's instruction? And what was the reason for these instructions? Anybody? That's the question out of the book. Kathy.
Well, God told them at the first that he was going to lead them into the land, and he used the ark as the symbol of him to do that. That's one thing. Another thing is the people had to stay approximately a half a mile away from the ark, so that nothing would happen to them, like you said. And it's just amazing that all those people could gather together, because there were thousands of people that had to cross over this river. And to get them all over.
Yeah, tens of thousands of people. Yeah.
So that was my comment.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, so yeah, that's the command. Hang back. Scott, did you have something?
Oh, just the consecrating yourselves, that idea, that came up a little bit earlier too. Getting rid of, purifying yourself in a way, right? To be ready to serve, to be ready to do what you need to do for God. And it really plays out. You're not very ready if you've got something really holding you down. Where it says set aside every weight that ensnares us, and get ready to run the race, because you've got to be ready by putting things aside, putting that old life aside, all that stuff, and now you're ready to serve God and do what He's going to do wonderful things through you once you are able, or once you allow Him to help you do that.
Yeah.
His way. He's told them how to do that, so they knew what to do. But that's cool.
That's a great point. I mean and it really goes back to what I said earlier, this first 5 chapters, God is making sure everything is in order. You're prepared, everything's in order, and this is one of those things, as you say, it transcends not just this physical thing that you're doing, but even the Christian. Before before we do anything, are we, do I spend some time in prayer to make sure that my life is lived within the context of doing God's will today? I'm just going to work, whatever, on the freeway, do we do those things? That's an interesting point. I didn't even pop out in my head, but that is exactly what God expects everybody to do if you're His servant, right? Is to make ourselves clean of all the junk of life that sticks to us during the day. Go home and take a shower or whatever. And get rid of all the stuff that accumulates through the day, rhetorically, analogy type thing. Anything else? Okay. He tells them, when you see the priests bearing the ark, pull up the stakes and let's go. And he orders the priests to take up the ark and travel to the Jordan River, stand in it. And again, really quick, and you find it in Numbers 4 that the Kohathites are given that responsibility of packing up all the holy stuff. And nobody else was supposed to do it. And there was a specific way that they did it. They would take down the veil and cover the ark. And then they would get these other skins and cover up the table of showbread and the lampstand and all of that. And they were told, don't touch anything. So we have to assume that there was this thing, there was a specific way they did it. There was a pattern by which they didn't actually touch it or see it. Otherwise, they would be dead. So this is a very important thing. So when we get to this part, I have to assume that, I'm assuming it was still covered because there are guys who are carrying this. And the rest of everybody else has to be somewhere off to the side, a half mile away from this thing. Yes, Barry?
Well, according to verse 4, there's another reason that they're not supposed to get near the ark, and that's so that they wouldn't be, so that they would be directly following the ark and not branching off to the left or the right, because they're coming down from a higher elevation,
Right.
down into the river valley there, and so they need to be able to have the priest carrying the ark spot the way for them to go,
Okay.
and not just be out there wandering around in the
Right.
hills.
Right. Now, that brings us into this next part. And the questions are, what was God going to do for crossing the Jordan? What time of the year was it? And what did that mean for the river? Well, very early on in my Christian walk, it was taught in class that during this flood season, the river could be a mile wide. Well, it's not that it was a mile wide like you would find the Missouri River or maybe the Mississippi, but in the sense that if you were like to go down to Blythe or El Centro or something, you would see, where the Colorado River or wherever comes out when it floods, it comes out, there's tributaries, there's lots of stringers that come off, little creeks and things. Walter's Camp is one of those. It's basically a channel. I don't know. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. But there's a little channel right there. And these little, when it floods, you get these little rivers. And so it wasn't going to be an easy crossing. And certainly the people on the other side wouldn't be expecting them to be crossing at this time of the year. It just wouldn't make sense. Dave, and then Barry.
Well, I kind of think it's reminiscent of the Red Sea.
Yes.
You come walking up to this river, oh great, how are we going to get across this? And then, it's like, what did God do here? Just bringing us to another obstacle kind of thing? Well, the thing is the trust that God's asking these people to have. Now, we're not talking 100 people. We're talking millions of people. And so that's why, one of the reasons I think there was a distance required, so you could have a clear view of that ark. All the people could see it. It's symbolic in many ways that God is with you, and you're going across it, and you're going to overcome. So it's a kind of really, symbolic and picturesque, but I think it's, for me, I think that's part of it. And, and they crossed. So again, yet once more,
Right.
trust in God, trust in God.
The crossing was made only by the fighting men at this point, though. So,
But still, they could still
but the
see
message
ark.
is going to go everywhere. It's just going to go everywhere. We find that the Amorite kings just go, what happened? We just heard about this. Who had their hand up over? Barry and then Randy.
Well, there's a couple of things about this time of year that makes it the perfect time for them to come into Canaan. First of all, as you were talking about, the kings weren't expecting it because you can't get across Jordan with a bunch of people like that because the water's moving too fast. It's too deep. It's just there's no way. It's a barrier. So they're sitting back there thinking, we're in good shape. So they're not preparing. They're just sitting ducks. The other thing is it's harvest time.
Yes.
So now they've got all this food stored up, and they're in the process, if they're not completely done with it. And so Israel is going in to take over these cities that are with their granaries are full.
God is going to provide for them at this point, this element of surprise. And you're right, because we see not too long from now, we're going to see manna stops. And they start eating of that land. That's exactly what the word said. Yes, Randy?
Yeah, Barry brought up a really good point about coming down straight behind the ark so as not to veer to the right or the left. And that's what Joshua was told, to meditate on the word and not to veer to the right or the left. So the symbology is there is following the word of God directly and not to veer off because the world pulls us off. We've always talked about our Christian walk as we're aiming for the goal, we're veering to the right, we're veering to the left, and we keep coming back. As long as our eyes are focused on where we're going, we can get back on the path. And that also reminds me of when Peter was sinking in the water, and Jesus said, keep your eyes on me, focus on me, as another way of telling us that if we will focus on God, we can do miracles. We can walk on water.
I'm not going to test that, but okay. Kathy?
According to Brent Kirscheville, if you read his lesson on this, he said that it was 16 miles across the river.
Yeah, when you look at the typical size of today's river, it's maybe 100 feet wide. And so the flood stage would have done something like that. And I just couldn't find any references that stated its current flood stages, or maybe flood stages back in the early 19th or 17th century. I couldn't find anything like that. But regardless of how big it was, it's not a big deal for God, no matter what it looked like. If it was 16 miles completely one side or the other, or if it was like when I'm thinking where you just have a lot of obstacles in the way, God did the same thing. And that's one of the questions. What was God... what does the crossing of the River Jordan reenact? And Dave talked about that. And what is the message? I mean, okay, you had the crossing of the Red Sea, right? Same thing. And people are crossing, they did it too. And now here they are, 40 years later, doing something very similar all over again. Yes. Did I just say similar? Similar. Anyway, sorry.
Well, what it says here is, one of the reasons is so that people will know that just as God was with Moses, God is with Joshua. And, that another kind of benefit of being behind the wall of water kind of backed up, every step that you take, just the confidence that would build in you as you approach the banks, is it's still standing. It would
Yeah,
take a while to get there, and it would take a while.
Yeah, and, you know, I talked about that with Barry, about the time it had to take. We talked about, he was making the note that these guys had to hold that Ark of the Covenant for some time, so maybe they had to have people help them, or God gave them extra strength, I don't know, but it doesn't say. But the way it happens, they step, we'll go over that, but they step in, and then the waters recede, and then the people cross, and then they come out of the water. We'll get into that specifically. So at some point, they're passing by the ark. They don't come out of the river until everybody's crossed. Okay. Betty, yeah, I'm sorry.
One thing that impressed me was down in verse 13, where it says, well, read the whole thing, it says, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, the waters that come down from upstream, and they shall stand as the heat. So it wasn't just parting the water that was right there. I mean, all this water was rushing down there, and it just kept coming up.
Right.
To me, if you try to visualize that, it's just impossible for me to actually visualize it completely. It had to be really something. You know. Cecil DeMille did a fairly good job with his movie for the Red Sea, but this is a different thing altogether. Like I kept thinking the same thing when I was trying to visualize it, that the river, did God stop the entire river? That would have meant Gethsemane, something would have had to happen up there. This whole God overtaking the law of gravity had to just be something amazing. And I don't know if all the water flowed dry and everybody downstream was thinking, what's going on? You know, or what? It's very, it had to be something so profound, obviously, that it scared a lot of people. Okay, okay, yeah, I've already talked about the difference between what happened the 40 years prior. People were willing to cross, they went across and they started to complain, and there were issues with their faith. Now we see a completely different people. These people are just ready. God made them ready in the desert. He made them a great army, is what he did, ready to do what they had to do. And they were faithful. They were practicing faith for the most part. I think God is just showing his authority over everything. Christ does that later when he comes to the earth as well. Okay, any questions or observations on this chapter? Okay. So next week, I'll let Danny know to start in chapter 4. Now, chapter 4 is about this memorial that they're going to build. They did this great thing through God. God did it through them, or whatever, how you want to say it. God's action was performed by them. Just like what a Christian does. We try to be more godly, that kind of thing. God orders it, they did it. So in order to remember, they set up this memorial. Scott?
I wasn't sure if we were going to get there or not, but I'd like to see little things like he had them choose 12 men before they went and didn't tell them what for. You know, it's just kind of cool until later, you know.
Go get a rock.
Yeah. Later on, he tells them in the next chapter, you know. But he starts off with just choose 12 men, and then he goes on with these other things. Like, okay, you know.
Yeah, these next.
It's neat how there's a lot of things that you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, but it has a purpose, you know.
It's interesting to see what God thinks is important for us to know. And it's these little things, you know, he could have just went right straight to Jericho, but he tells us all these other little important things. Yes.
You know, the waters were backed up halfway to the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
a long way.
Exactly. Okay, we'll start in chapter